Nobody in the compound knew his real name. They called him Kofi. He was the quiet one, the one who swept the yard before anyone else was awake, the one who never spoke unless spoken to, never complained when given the worst jobs, and never looked up when the young masters walked past without acknowledging him. He was, to everyone who lived and worked in that large compound, simply a servant. Nobody important, nobody worth remembering. But every single night, when the compound went to sleep and the lights in the main house went dark, Kofi would sit on the edge of his small bed in the servants' quarters, press his hands together, and close his eyes. And in the silence he would say the same words to himself that he had said every night for 6 years. Not yet. The time is not yet. His real name was Emeka Osei, and 6 years before he became Kofi the servant, he had been a king. The Osei family had led their community for generations. It was not the kind of leadership that came from elections or appointments. It was something older, something that ran in the blood and was confirmed by tradition, by the elders, and by the people themselves. When Emeka's father passed away after a long illness, the entire ceremony of succession was carried out properly. The elders gathered, the seal was presented, the blessing was given. Emeka Osei, at the age of 28, became the alpha king of his family dynasty. He was not a perfect man, but he was a serious one. He took his responsibilities with both hands. He began reorganizing the family's land holdings. He met with lawyers to settle old disputes. He opened the dynasty's accounts to a proper audit for the first time in 20 years. He wanted everything clean. He wanted everything documented. He believed that a strong foundation was the only thing worth building on. His uncle, Chief Kwame Darko, watched all of this very carefully. Darko was the kind of man who smiled when he meant the opposite. He had spent his entire adult life standing close to power without ever holding it. And that closeness had curdled inside him into something ugly. When Emeka's father was alive, Darko had managed to remain useful enough to stay in the inner circle. But now that a young man sat on the throne, a young man who was already asking questions about finances and records, Darko understood that his time of comfortable influence was ending. He decided to act before Emeka could discover what he had spent years hiding. It happened on a Thursday night, at 3 in the morning. Emeka was in his private study, reading through a set of land agreements that had been flagged for review. The compound was quiet. The guards were at their posts. Everything felt normal. And then the door to his study opened, and 12 men walked in. They were not strangers. He recognized 2 of them as members of the compound's own security team. The rest were men he had never seen before. Behind all of them, standing in the doorway in a long dark robe, was his uncle Kwame Darko. Emeka did not shout. He did not reach for anything. He simply looked at his uncle's face, and in the space of 2 seconds, he understood everything. The expression on Darko's face was not anger, was not guilt, was not even cruelty. It was satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who had waited a very long time for a moment, and was finally experiencing it. "I am sorry it has to be this way," Darko said, and his voice carried no apology at all. Emeka was taken out of the compound through a back gate, put into a vehicle, and driven through the night for several hours. He was left in a small room in a village far from home, with no phone, no identification, no money, and no way to contact anyone who could help him. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Darko had already gathered the council of elders. He presented them with documents, all of them forged, all of them professionally produced, that showed Emeka had been secretly stealing from the family treasury and selling family land to outside developers. 5 of the 7 elders had already been spoken to privately. The other 2 were shown the documents and told that the decision had already been made. Within 3 days, the announcement went out. Emeka Osei had been found guilty of betraying his dynasty. His name was removed from the official records. His photographs were taken down. The story that spread through the community was the story Darko had written, and Darko had written it well. Chief Kwame Darko took the throne. Emeka spent 3 days alone in that small room without doing very much at all. He ate the little food that had been left for him. He slept when his body demanded it. He sat with the walls and the silence and let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. He did not pretend it did not hurt. It hurt in ways he did not have words for. He had loved his uncle as a child. He had believed in the loyalty of men who had now turned their backs. He had built plans for his dynasty that would never now be carried out. All of that was real, and he sat with all of it. But on the fourth day, something shifted in him. He picked up a small piece of paper from the floor, a torn corner of an old receipt that had blown in under the door, and he began to write. He wrote down everything he knew, every name, every document that could be traced, every person who had been in that room the night he was taken, every elder who had signed Darko's decree. He wrote until the paper was full, and then he held it in his hands and looked at it for a long time. He was not destroyed. He had been moved. There was a difference. He gave himself a new name, Kofi, took what little he had, and began walking toward the one place his enemy would never think to look for him. He walked toward the compound itself. He was going to go directly into his uncle's house and work as a servant, and he was going to stay there until he had everything he needed. The hiring steward at the compound was a tired man, with too many things to manage, and not enough people to manage them. When a quiet, lean fellow named Kofi appeared at the service entrance with a recommendation letter and asked for work, the steward looked him over for about 4 seconds and pointed him toward the yard. And so Emeka Osei, the rightful king of the Osei dynasty, became the man who swept the yard. The early weeks were the hardest, not because of the physical work, which was demanding but manageable, but because of the small daily cruelties that came with being invisible. Darko's son, a young man of 22, who had grown up watching his father treat people carelessly, had fully inherited that carelessness. He would snap his fingers to get Kofi's attention. He would send him on needless errands at the end of long days, and then complain that the tasks were done too slowly. Once, he spilled a full cup of water on the floor, looked directly at Kofi, and walked away without a word. Kofi cleaned the floor, he said nothing. Inside himself, he was not practicing patience so much as he was practicing purpose. Every humiliation was information. Every careless conversation he overheard while sweeping nearby was a piece of the picture he was assembling. Because the thing about servants, he had quickly discovered, was that powerful people forget they are in the room. They speak freely, they argue in hallways, they make phone calls with doors half open, they say things in front of the help that they would never say in front of equals, and Kofi listened to all of it. Her name was Abena Mensah, and she had worked in the Darko compound for 11 years. She was the head housekeeper, a woman in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes, and the particular kind of wisdom that comes from spending a long time watching other people very closely. She noticed Kofi within his first 2 weeks. It was not one thing, it was many small things. The way he held his back straight, even when doing work that bent other men over. The way he memorized the compound's layout faster than anyone she had ever seen hired. The way he handled being treated poorly. Not with the dullness of a man who had given up, and not with the boiling resentment of a man about to cause trouble, but with the stillness of a man who was waiting for something specific. One evening she found him in the storage room at the back of the main building, standing very still near a shelf of old files. He was not touching anything, he was simply looking. When he heard her enter, he turned around without panic, without guilt, with nothing on his face except a calm and quiet acknowledgement that she was there. "Who are you?" she asked him quietly. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "A man who is not yet ready to say." She studied his face. She had lived long enough and watched enough people to know that this was not an evasion. It was a truth, with a time limit on it. She nodded slowly, said nothing more, and left the room. From that day forward, Abena Mensah began, in small and careful ways, to make things easier for him. She arranged the duty roster so that he was assigned to areas of the compound that were useful to him. She covered for small absences that she pretended not to notice. She never asked him another question. But when he finally told her the truth, months later, in a whispered conversation in the kitchen, after everyone else had gone to bed, she did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had already known and had simply been waiting for confirmation. "What do you need?" she asked. "Time," he said. "And for you to continue doing exactly what you're already doing." Over the next several years, Emeka built something extraordinary from almost nothing. He did it slowly and carefully, one connection at a time, always through intermediaries, always with enough separation that no single person could see the whole picture except him. He found Elder Asante, the oldest surviving member of the original council who had been present at Emeka's true coronation. The man was in his late 70s, living quietly in a small house on the edge of town, and he was haunted. He had been threatened the night of the takeover and had stayed silent ever since. But silence, Emeka told him when they finally met in person, was not the same as agreement, and the time for silence was almost over. He made careful contact with two lawyers who worked in a city far away and who specialized in matters of succession and contested family authority. He sent them documents piece by piece over many months, never through any channel that could be traced back to the compound. He identified a journalist who had written about Darko's rise with a precision that suggested she had questions she had not yet been able to answer publicly. And one evening, after nearly a year of waiting for exactly the right moment, he was in a back corridor of the main house when he heard Darko on the telephone in the next room. The door was half open. Darko was speaking to someone he trusted, and he was speaking with the looseness of a man who feels completely safe. He was describing, in clear and specific detail, exactly how the false documents had been created, who had helped him, and which elders had been paid to cooperate. Emeka had a small recording device that he had obtained months earlier through Abina. He held it very still near the gap in the door and did not breathe. When the call ended and Darko's footsteps moved away from the door, Emeka stood alone in the corridor for a long time. He looked down at the device in his hand. He thought about the piece of torn paper he had written on 6 years ago in that small village room. He thought about every floor he had swept, every insult he had absorbed. Every night he had sat on the edge of his bed and reminded himself that the time had not yet come. He thought, "It is almost time now." Chief Kwame Darko planned the celebration for months. It was to mark 10 years since his restoration of the dynasty, his word for what he had done. He invited government officials, business leaders, journalists, community elders, and respected figures from across the region. He arranged a grand ceremony in the compound's main hall. He commissioned a tribute video to be played on large screens. He ordered the best food and the finest decorations. He wanted this evening to be the moment that made his legacy permanent. He assigned the servant Kofi to help manage the event preparations. Emeka spent the week before the ceremony making his final arrangements. He coordinated with Elder Asante. He confirmed with the lawyers. He reached the journalist and gave her everything she would need. He briefed Abena on what was coming so that she could be safe and positioned correctly. He replaced the tribute video that was scheduled to play on the screens with something else entirely. On the evening of the ceremony, he dressed in his white servant's uniform and moved through the room quietly, as he always had, adjusting chairs and carrying trays, and being noticed by no one. Darko swept in wearing elaborate ceremonial clothing, greeting his important guests with wide arms and a large smile. The hall filled, the music played, the lights were warm and golden. Darko stood to give his address. He spoke about legacy. He spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about how much he had given to bring the dynasty to where it stood today. The room listened respectfully. Several people nodded. A few applauded at the right moments. And then the screens behind him flickered. The tribute video did not play. Instead, the room filled with a voice. It was a clear, sharp, completely recognizable voice. And it was saying things that made the room go very still. It was describing forged documents. It was naming the elders who had been paid. It was explaining, in careful and specific language, exactly how an innocent man had been removed from power and replaced by someone who had no right to the throne. It was Chief Kwame Darko's own voice. The room changed in stages. First there was confusion, as people looked at each other and at the screens. Then there was recognition, as those who knew Darko's voice confirmed to themselves what they were hearing. Then there was a silence so complete that the sound of a chair shifting somewhere near the back of the room seemed very loud. And then, through that silence, a man in a white servant's uniform walked steadily to the front of the hall. He did not run. He did not shout. He walked the way he had always walked in that compound, measured and deliberate, except that now every person in the room was watching him. He stopped at the front, reached up, and removed the outer layer of his uniform jacket. Beneath it was a single garment, carefully prepared and folded against his body all evening, a deep blue robe bearing the unmistakable seal of the Osei bloodline, a seal that could not be purchased or copied. A seal that every person in that room with any connection to the dynasty recognized immediately. He did not announce himself. He simply stood and let the room understand. Elder Asante rose from his seat near the far wall. His hands were shaking, but his voice was not. He had waited 6 years to use that voice, and it came out steady and clear. He produced the original coronation record, the document Darko had believed he had destroyed, but which the old elder had hidden in a place no one had thought to search. He held it up, and he spoke to the room about what he had witnessed, and what he had been afraid to say for far too long. The room was no longer quiet. It was alive with voices. But above all the voices, there was a current of something powerful moving through the hall. Something that felt like a long overdue correction. Chief Kwame Darko was escorted from the hall that night by security men who had understood, in the space of 15 minutes, exactly where their loyalty was required to be. He did not speak on his way out. He looked, for the first time in 10 years, like a man who had run out of words. In the days that followed, the legal process moved quickly. 2 of the lawyers filed formally on behalf of the Osei succession. 3 of the 5 compromised elders gave their testimonies voluntarily, each one describing the pressure that had been placed on them a decade earlier. The journalist published her account, supported by the recordings, the documents, and the testimony of Elder Asante. It was read across the region within hours of going up. Emeka's first public address was short. He stood before a gathering of community members, family representatives, and media, with the same stillness he had carried with him for 6 years, and he said the following: "A king does not return to destroy, he returns to restore. That is the only thing I am here to do." People wept, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, and they recognized truth when they finally heard it. Among the first things Emeka did after reclaiming his position was summon Abena Mensa. He met her privately, not in a formal setting, not in front of anyone. He thanked her simply and directly. He told her that her decency in those years had meant more to him than she could know. He arranged for her children's education to be fully covered, and her future to be secure. She tried to tell him it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same. "That is not true," he told her gently. "And we both know it." She did not argue with that. He also did not pretend that the 6 years had been anything other than what they were. There were nights in that servant's room that had come close to breaking him. There was a woman he had loved before his fall, who had eventually built a life with someone else, because the world had told her that Emeka Osei no longer existed. He did not blame her. He understood that people could only make choices based on the information they were given, and the information they had been given was a lie. He carried all of it quietly, the way he had learned to carry everything, not by pretending it was not heavy, but by deciding that the weight was worth it. People who knew the story would sometimes ask him, in the years that followed, what had kept him going during those 6 years. How had he stayed in that compound, done that work, absorbed all of that, and not been hollowed out by it? He always gave the same answer. "I never forgot who I was," he would say. "They took my name, my title, my home, and my freedom of movement. But a man's knowledge of himself is not something that can be taken from the outside. I knew what I was. I knew what had been done. I knew what was true. And I trusted that truth is not permanent only when it is convenient. Truth is permanent always. It simply sometimes requires patience to arrive at the moment when it can be seen." He would pause after saying this, and then he would add one more thing. "I also had good people, one good person at least, who saw me when no one else did." Never underestimate what one decent human being can mean to a person in the dark. This is a true story about a man who was stripped of everything and chose, in the silence of his lowest moment, not revenge, but something far more demanding. He chose patience. He chose strategy. He chose to build, carefully and quietly, an architecture of truth that could not be argued with when it finally stood in the light. He had swept floors and been ignored, and been given the worst duties, and been passed by people who owed him their loyalty. And he had done all of it without bitterness, because bitterness was a prison he refused to enter. The throne was always his. He simply had to demonstrate, to himself more than to anyone else, that he was worthy of the weight it carried. When the crown was returned to his head, it did not feel like victory, it felt like arrival. Like the end of a very long journey that he had always known, in the deepest part of himself, was going in the right direction. He had never doubted where he was going. He had simply been willing to walk the long way to get there.